October 1962. John F. Kennedy's moment in history had arrived, and he knew it. Spy photos showed Soviet missile sites in communist Cuba. The president thought of his options. They were few, and he felt the tug of all human struggles. Unthinkable stakes were on the table. And Khrushchev, so unpredictable, what would he do? At this vexing moment, the specter of atomic war looming in his war room, the President of the United States turned to his trusted lieutenants and said, with that wry Kennedy smile in his eyes, "I hope you realize that there's not enough room for everybody in the White House bomb shelter." That was Kennedy at his best, making humor at the hour of darkness. It wasn't that he was funny. He was serious with his humor. He went right to the heart of a subject, straight to the truth. After back surgery in 1944, he told a friend, "The doc should have read one more book before picking up the saw." Before his presidential campaign of 1960, he was asked if he had a favorite candidate. "I do," he answered. "But until he has the guts to declare he's a candidate, I'm not going to announce my support of him." After a speech in Wisconsin, a boy asked how he became a war hero. "It was easy," he said. "They sank my boat."
You could see jokes forming in his mind before he got them. He'd pause, and his eyes would twinkle, and then he'd get it off. I thought he was very funny. He made me laugh a lot.
His humor was no ploy. It was John Kennedy's gift of survival, his weapon of choice. His father called him Johnny, but his friends called him Jack. He was born with one leg longer than the other, which gave him that familiar jaunt. He never caught colds, but his immune system was a mess, and he spent half his life sick in bed. He read 1,200 words a minute, was a poor speller, had a huge vocabulary, and terrible handwriting. He typed most of his letters. He liked steak, chowder, and ice cream, and milk served ice cold. About prejudice, he just didn't know. He was for capital punishment, not against abortion, and a practicing Catholic, if not devout. He was comfortable with secrets and lies, yet his life was an open book.
He had defects. We all know what they were. He liked women.
He was vain about his hair and worked on his tan. Loved the ocean, sailing, and racing, and he craved action in every endeavor.
He was addicted to excitement. He was addicted to danger. He was addicted to being on the edge. He lived his life as a race against boredom.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
On January 20th, 1961, John F. Kennedy became the 35th President of the United States. He came with great promise and enormous vision. But critics said he was all style and no substance. Too Catholic, too young, and too rich.
We're talking about it. He said, we didn't always have this kind of money. And he said, if you want to see a humble beginning, go to the house in Brooklyn, where I guess they lived when he was born.
He was born here, at 83 Beale Street in Brookline, Massachusetts, May 29th, 1917. Tuesday's child. His father was Joseph Patrick Kennedy, the son of a Boston Irish saloon keeper. His mother was Rose Elizabeth Fitzgerald, daughter of John Honey Fitzgerald, the mayor of Boston. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was the second of 9 children born to Joe and Rose. The first was Joseph Patrick Jr., named after his father. On the day Joe was born, his grandpa, Honey Fitz, declared that he would grow up to be President of the United States, and that became Joe's nickname, the future president. When Rose delivered her second baby, there were no predictions. The only thing anybody said was a prayer for the boy named after Honey Fitz. They prayed he would live. John F. Kennedy was born with blue eyes, a wonderful smile, and an adrenal deficiency called Addison's disease. He was given the last rites of his church at birth, the first of 5 times in his life. But this boy had more than just a will to survive. He had a will to greatness.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world.
In 1920, John Kennedy was the second boy in a rapidly growing family. He commanded an equal share of attention from his parents, was the idol of his sister Rosemary, and the perfect foil to his older brother Joe. Rose dressed her boys alike, which made them compete for identity. As a modern mother, Rose kept track of her children on index cards. She listed vital statistics at regular intervals: birth dates, height and weight, confirmation, and illness. Jack was sick all the time. That winter of 1920, just after the birth of the 4th Kennedy child, named Kathleen, Jack came down with scarlet fever. Quarantined from his newborn sister, he nearly died. Again, they gave him the last rites, and again, he survived. Like clockwork, 1921 brought a 5th child, a daughter named Eunice. Regularly, Rose took her children to St. Aidan's Church in Brookline. Here, Jack was christened and confirmed. Rose also took her clan to see her own birthplace in the historic North End of Boston, and to the church where she was christened. Down the street, she showed them another church, where the American Revolution was born.
He said, I want to tell you that my interest in history came from my mother. That she was the one around, that we were little, she was the one there. Dad was away, and she read to us, and she helped us, and she took me to Plymouth Rock and the Old North Church and those things around Boston. And he remembered that very vividly.
Jack began reading at an early age. Rose and Joe found this out when he asked about the Canary Islands, a setting in his Billy Whiskers book. Another favorite was King Arthur and the Knights. That, Rose recalled, gave Jack his first impression of Camelot. Joe and Rose Kennedy aspired to something different. All they wanted was social respect in Boston. But the aristocrats of old New England, the Cabots and the Lodges, refused them at the door.
They had it awfully tough at the beginning, coming from Boston, because there the division was so clear. A great Irish sector of wonderful people, but also with the waspish area, not that commingling, definitely not.
To Joe, this was infuriating, and it was the impetus to make more money. Frequently, he was out of town on business, playing the stock market in New York. To Rose, this was frustrating. Despite the family's growing wealth, she felt abandoned in Brookline. So she went on vacations, finding solace beyond devotion in countries abroad. Jack was a precocious 5-year-old. He wanted to be a policeman, and he also noticed when his mother left town. Once, before a trip, he said to her, "Gee, you're a great mother to go away and leave your children all alone." Rose remembered those stinging words half a century later. Jack and his older brother attended public grade school at Edward Devotion in Brookline. Here, the Protestant boys called them micks and picked fights. It was the burden of being Irish and Catholic. In October of 1924, Rose withdrew her boys from Edward Devotion and sent them to Dexter, a private school.
All the teachers were women, and basically they were spinsters, and they were marvelous teachers. They were just incredibly good teachers, very strict, but brought out a lot in you as boys.
At Dexter, Joe and Jack found equality in the classroom and on the athletic field. By 1927, there were 7 Kennedy children, with the 8th on the way. That year, Joe Kennedy moved his family to New York. He wanted to be near Wall Street to capitalize on huge loopholes in stock market trading laws. And he did. Among many acquisitions, Joe Kennedy bought a Hollywood movie studio. For a while, he enjoyed going out west, being a mogul, and dabbling in pictures. He also enjoyed the attention of a certain movie starlet. Showing very little discretion, Joe Kennedy had an affair with actress Gloria Swanson. Rose knew, of course, but didn't let on. As for 11-year-old Jack, he became fascinated by the company of movie stars. Between 1927 and 1929, Joe Kennedy got richer and the family got bigger. Then, the bottom dropped out of the stock market, but Joe had wisely sold short before the crash.
He said, "As you know, we had one of the huge fortunes of that time, and my father preserved it. It was not lost in the crash of 29. And he said, we traveled more, we had bigger houses, we had more servants than ever. We had a better life than ever."
During the Depression, Joe Kennedy bought a summer home at Hyannisport, Cape Cod, and a winter home in Palm Beach, Florida. These became Jack's favorite resorts. By the age of 14, Jack was a good but distracted student. So his parents sent him to the Choate School in Wallingford, Connecticut, to follow in the footsteps of his 16-year-old brother, Joe.
Joe was the prominent person in the family, the number one son. He was a great football hero. He was very popular. He was very well known and very, very healthy. So they were extremely close. Competitive, as all of them were, but extremely close.
Jack played sports and did everything Joe did, but not to the same degree of success, partly because he was often sick and confined to Choate's infirmary. There, he developed other skills.
I think that his personality, which obviously was a pretty powerful piece of business, a lot of that comes from the fact that he was in bed so much. And he had to attract people, even when he was a little kid, and interest them into spending time with him when he couldn't move from the room he was in. And he did that with enormous success. People were delighted to spend time with him.
He talked about that all the time in the hospital and the days spent with Lem Billings. I guess the two of them were in hospital rooms a good deal when they were teenagers. And that's where he developed his reading skills and his love of history.
Lemoyne Billings and Jack Kennedy became fast friends at Choate. They were ideally suited. Lem, the gawky straight man, and Jack, the dashing comic. Their friendship lasted for life. Unlike Lem or his brother Joe, Jack was not a Choate role model. He earned passing grades, but was often too sick for class. Still, he found strength to clown around after hours. Surprisingly, Jack dreaded history. It was taught by J.J. Marr, a teacher he despised. Marr was also the football coach and a stern disciplinarian. No matter how Jack tried, he could not escape Marr, who challenged his happy-go-lucky way of life. Dodging discipline, Jack devised clever ways to mock school authority. His senior year, he formed an unofficial club, the Muckers Club. It was loosely inspired by the muckraking literature of the day, which Jack admired. If nothing else, Jack proved to be a great leader of the Muckers, and for his efforts, he was nearly expelled on the eve of graduation. That February 1935, the headmaster called him on the carpet and put an end to the Muckers Club. But Jack had the last laugh. In his very first political campaign, he lobbied his loyal Choate classmates to vote him most likely to succeed. Then he graduated in the middle of his class. An auspicious beginning, of sorts.
There was one thing that, of course, was obvious, that the highest service people had was in government, that you reached the top of human activity, not in business, not in the arts, not in writing, but in Washington, D.C., in the government.
Rose and Joe began grooming their children around the family dining table.
His father was a winner. He believed in winning. I don't think there was any place in their life for someone who would lose. His mother was a very gracious, very religious lady, and from both of them he gained something. I guess it's well known the Kennedys used to have that round table discussion every day at home where each of them brought up something new at the family table and discussed it. They were encouraged to be competitive, encouraged to be winners.
Their education expanded with travel, and each family trip had a purpose. In 1933, Rose and Joe went to Europe, where Mr. Kennedy was arranging to import British liquor to the U.S., a timely move before the repeal of Prohibition. Joe Jr. was already there, taking courses at the London School of Economics before entering Harvard. Jack didn't get to go on that trip, because he had flunked Latin and was bound over for summer school at Choate. But his turn came 2 years later. Like Joe, he enrolled in courses at the London School of Economics, but he only lasted a few weeks. In October 1935, Jack's mysterious lifelong illness put him in a London hospital. British doctors said he was a most amazing case. At age 18, he was 6 feet tall, 135 pounds, and losing weight. So his father brought him home. Jack was glad. He wanted to attend college with his Choate chums, and they were at Princeton. Though accepted to Harvard and expected to attend, Jack transferred with his father's consent.
I was at Princeton, as a matter of fact, in my junior and senior year when Jack came for that brief visit. Jack seemed to be light and pleasant and sort of at ease, totally at ease, as he was almost all his life.
That fall at Princeton, Jack became seriously ill and was forced to drop out. After a battery of harrowing medical tests, doctors decided he had leukemia. To Lem, Jack wrote, "Took a peek at my chart yesterday and could see that they were mentally measuring me for a coffin. Tomorrow or next week, we attend my funeral." Young Jack Kennedy was familiar with his chances in life and quickly developed a brave sense of gallows humor. By the fall of 1936, Jack felt well enough to start college at Harvard, where he belonged. Here, he decided to blaze a new family trail, do something his father and brother hadn't done, get accepted to one of Harvard's exclusive social clubs. But Jack met roadblocks.
Nobody wanted to accept Jack Kennedy. And there was nothing against Jack Kennedy. The problem was Jack Kennedy's father, Jack Kennedy's grandfather, who were old Boston Irish, and there was a prejudice against the Kennedys because of that.
Despite this old prejudice, Jack was determined to join a club.
That's a tendency that most people don't know about him, because he never lost his basic Irish, tough-minded nature, but he aspired to a social status that his rest of his family found difficult to attain.
Jack devised a strategy. He recruited his Harvard roommates to rush all the clubs as a group, one for all and all for one. And all the clubs turned them down, but for one.
The Speed Club, oriented towards New York, came to us and said, we'd like to take Jack Kennedy. And so that's how we came here.
Jack ate all his meals at the Speed Club and studied there as well. But most of all, he liked the club because it was a jock house. Though skinny, he played football and earned his letter. He also made the swim team and competed in the backstroke. In the summer of 1937, Jack and Lem Billings took a whirlwind tour of Europe, just the two of them, traveling on a modest budget in a convertible jalopy. Their route took them to several World War I battle sites, where Jack came face to face with his father's personal demons. As Jack looked over the many American graves in France, he remembered that his father had dodged enlistment in 1917. It gave him cause to contemplate his own destiny. Everywhere they went, Lem and Jack saw pictures of Mussolini and Hitler. In Austria and Germany, they met some young soldiers, and Jack quizzed them about their politics. Clearly, he perceived an impending storm. Everywhere, people were preparing for war. Everywhere except England. When he returned to Harvard that fall, he quizzed the Speed Club men.
We were 19 or 20-year-olds that were really thinking about the next sports event or the next movie. He was beyond that. He was really concerned about international affairs. And when we'd have breakfast here at the club, he was the one that would raise the question, now, what do you think of Hitler?
That fall of 1937, Jack Kennedy woke up to the world around him. Jack's passion for world politics matured in 1937. After his summer trip to Europe, he returned to Harvard, bursting with intellectual curiosity. But that fall, he suffered a freak football injury, ironically delivered by his family chauffeur.
He came running across the field. Nobody saw him, and he threw a sort of a half-baked block at Jack and knocked him down. I don't think he meant to do that, and I think he thought that Jack probably had seen him. But he knocked him down, and that was when he started having back trouble.
Immobilized again, Jack focused on his reading.
He read deeply. He read 10 books a week by one estimate. He was a speed reader. He could go through 1,200 words a minute or more. And it was biography, and it was history.
He read so fast that it was hard to believe that he really absorbed it all, but he'd go through a book in a couple of days, or a day even.
In January of 1938, Jack's father was appointed U.S. ambassador to England. It was a political triumph for Joe Kennedy and a great opportunity for the family. That June, Jack and Joe Jr. skippered Harvard boats in the Intercollegiate Yacht Regatta, which they won. Then they sailed to England with their famous father, with newsreel cameras rolling. The first order of business was a royal debut for Kathleen and Rosemary. After the party, all the Kennedys traveled to the French Riviera for a vacation in Cannes. In late August, Jack returned to Harvard to begin his junior year. The great question that autumn of 1938 was whether Adolf Hitler should be appeased or opposed. The prevailing view in England was to pacify the Nazi leader. In September, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain signed a brittle peace pact with Germany, and war seemed averted. Then, the Nazis blitzed Czechoslovakia. Joe Kennedy remained in favor of appeasing the Germans. He said, quote, "Democracies and dictatorships have to live together in the same world, whether we like it or not." It was a tacit endorsement of Hitler and stirred heated debate. Back at Harvard, Jack studied the situation, sounding out the opinions of peers and professors.
He had a problem with his father in that case, because his father couldn't make up his mind what to do about Germany. And Jack, I don't know that they had a face-to-face debate, but as we were sitting here at breakfast, he said, "I think my father's wrong about this."
That's a big change, too, because you have to break away from your old man and finally go up and say to him, "Look, I think you're wrong as hell."
The issue became an intellectual puzzle for Jack, but it tormented his father. Capitulate or fight?
Because your natural feeling is say, well, I don't want my boy to go to war. But on the other hand, you also say, we got to do something about those bastards. They're running across the world.
The temperament of the country was to do something about Hitler. So Joe Kennedy's outspoken opinions put him in a political doghouse, which didn't escape Jack's notice.
He would talk about his father and kind of roll his eyes because of the attitudes his father displayed back in those early years. On the other hand, I remember one night he said, well, he's entitled to think what he wants.
In February of 1939, Jack skipped the spring term at Harvard and returned to Europe, wanting to witness the unfolding drama. Everywhere, he saw the signs of war. In a letter to his father, he wrote, "The German people are being whipped into a fierce hatred of the British." But England remained unprepared. Why? On August 20th, Jack was in Berlin and met the U.S. ambassador to Germany, who gave him a secret message to deliver by hand to Jack's father in London. It said 4 words: war within a week. 10 days later, Germany invaded Poland. On September 3rd, 1939, Britain's parliament declared war on Nazi Germany. In the audience that rainy autumn morning was Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy, his sons, Joe and Jack, and daughter Kathleen. The ambassador was mumbling, "It's the end of the world, the end of everything." To the young Kennedys, it was the beginning. Jack, in particular, was fascinated by the great stage of history with all its famous players. It was history in motion, like a performance of King Henry V at Shakespeare's Globe.
We in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers.
Kennedy took common things and lifted them to poetry sometimes. Took almost every issue and every moment and somehow saw it in a wider context. He was out there on the stage with Churchill and de Gaulle and Roosevelt, and he relished the company.
That dreadful night of September 3rd, in the brooding waters of the North Atlantic Ocean, A German U-boat torpedoed the SS Athenia, a British liner bound for New York. 112 died, including 28 Americans. As his father's representative, Jack Kennedy went to Glasgow, Scotland, to meet and console the American survivors. There, he received his first lesson in international diplomacy. The tired, angry, scared Americans greeted the ambassador's son with a demand. They wanted a naval convoy to escort them to New York. Jack assured their safety aboard a passenger ship flying the neutral U.S. flag, but the survivors were unconvinced. In the London newspapers, Jack received mixed reviews. The Telegraph called him a schoolboy diplomat, but the Evening News wrote that he displayed a wisdom and sympathy of a man twice his age. 2 weeks later, Jack returned to Harvard for his senior year, with his political education well underway.
Very difficult to say that Jack was in love with anyone. I don't feel that he was until he met Frances Ann Cannon.
Jack had dated Frances Ann Cannon for the better part of a year. When he returned from Europe that fall, he assumed she would be there waiting for him. But her heart had wandered to another man. Suddenly, Jack had just one goal. He would soothe his wounded ego by writing a great senior paper and get it published. With boundless energy, Jack focused his lively mind on a ponderous subject: why England had failed to prepare for war. Using his father's connections and the U.S. diplomatic pouch, he obtained obscure books and publications from London and Washington, read volumes of information, assimilated the material, and produced an insightful paper titled Appeasement at Munich. In it, Jack came to a profoundly simple conclusion. If you decide that the democratic form is the best, be prepared to make certain great sacrifices. Jack graduated with honors by virtue of his thesis, but few thought it worth publishing. Still, Jack pursued a book contract and got one. Released in August of 1940, John F. Kennedy's first book was titled Why England Slept. The critics called it an apology for his father's outspoken views, but Jack was openly dissenting from his father. In truth, the book was published and became a bestseller despite Joe Kennedy's influence. That summer of 1940, as Hitler strolled the streets of Paris, Jack Kennedy enjoyed new celebrity as an author. Beyond Harvard, he was uncertain of the future. He listed law as his vocation, but instead went to business school at Stanford University in California, the so-called Harvard of the West. Here, he pursued an intellectual vacation. Jack focused more on social diversions than academics. One co-ed in particular caught his eye. Her name was Harriet Price, but her friends called her Flip.
Jack asked me out, and that was the beginning of a short romance. He was very attractive, and I thought very handsome and very charming. As I got to know him, I found out what he was really like. I mean, what his real interests were, which were politics.
Jack was the most popular man on campus, and she had been voted the campus queen. So it was natural that Jack would go after the campus queen. He didn't go for the lesser ones. He went for the top. I think that she was a quest.
He was always turning on the news on the car radio. And one night I got tired of listening to the news. I reached over and turned it off. And he got absolutely furious. He had quite a hot temper.
She had very mixed feelings about Jack, and it was a duel between the two. Was he or was he not going to get her into bed?
I knew it wouldn't work, and he knew it wouldn't work.
She had a conventional notion that you did not go to bed with someone until that ring was on your finger.
I do remember we went down to the beach, and it was a beautiful, cold, windy day, and we walked on the beach, and he wrote, "I love you," in the sand.
For all of Jack's passion, his heart came second to his mind, and he remained steadfastly engaged to the raging political debate of 1940. Should America enter the war? To all who would listen, Jack solemnly said, "There is a war on, and we are going to get into it." In October 1940, Jack publicly registered for the first peacetime draft in U.S. history, and his number was the 18th drawn. For the Kennedy family, the irony was clear. His father had avoided enlistment in 1917 and opposed the draft in 1940. Yet Jack had volunteered, and his number was called. But Jack failed his physical, and the Army refused him. After 3 months in California, Jack returned to Palm Beach that Christmas, determined to improve his health. He swam every day in the family pool, and even followed a mail-order fitness program sold by strongman Charles Atlas.
He worked very hard and pulled all the strings his father could do for him to get into the service, to get into the Navy. That's what he wanted. Notice he went to the Navy, not the Army. Navy was more Ivy League.
Jack's brother, Joe, had no trouble passing his physical. He enlisted in the Navy in June of 1941 and qualified for naval aviation. Miraculously, Jack passed a physical exam in August, was quickly commissioned an ensign in the Navy, then assigned to the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington, D.C. There, in the nation's capital, he took up residence near his sister Kathleen, who had a job with the Washington Times-Herald. That November 1941, unspeakable sorrow visited the Kennedys. Few people outside the family knew that Rosemary Kennedy was mentally handicapped from birth. She had always received the unbridled love of her parents, brothers, and sisters. But at the age of 23, she had the mind of a girl with the sexual curiosity of a woman. Joe Kennedy feared a family scandal, so he submitted his charming, childlike daughter to an experimental form of psychosurgery, a lobotomy. Instead of scandal, Rosemary became the unwitting victim of a tragedy. Jack responded to his father's deed with an act of open defiance. As America entered the Second World War after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, he began dating a colleague of Kathleen's against his father's wishes. Inga Arvad was a sophisticated Danish beauty, 28 years old, and married. But worse, she was suspected of being a Nazi spy because she had once interviewed Adolf Hitler. In January of 1942, Inga became the target of FBI surveillance. Her phone and bedroom bugged, her intimacies violated. In memos, the Bureau documented all her contacts, including an ensign known only as Jack. This defiant affair with Inga was no secret, but it became public when Walter Winchell found out. In his nationally syndicated gossip column, he wrote, "One of ex-Ambassador Kennedy's eligible sons is the target of a Washington gal columnist's affections. Pa Kennedy no like." Pa Kennedy didn't like, nor did the U.S. Navy. Jack worked in naval intelligence. Was the ambassador's son a security risk? The government immediately pulled Winchell's item from the papers, and the next day, the ensign known only as Jack was transferred to South Carolina. To a friend, he fumed. They shagged my ass down to South Carolina because I was going around with a Scandinavian blonde, and they thought she was a spy. Inga Arvad was no spy, and their love affair was stronger than the pressure of society, the FBI, and Big Joe Kennedy. Jack and Inga brazenly exposed all their passion to Hoover's bugs. But the affair could not withstand the great chisel of war. In March of 1942, as Jack prepared to join the fight, Inga found the key to his heart, and in a revealing letter, challenged him to open it.
Maybe your gravest mistake, handsome, is that you admire brains more than heart. If you feel anything beautiful in your life, I'm not talking about me, then don't hesitate to say so. In the near future, life is going to be tough, and double hard for the people who have ideals, who have hopes, who have someone they really love.
I asked Kennedy, I said, do you have any memory of the Depression? And I remember he thought a little while and said, no. Kennedy was a great lounger. He always had his feet on the desk. And he took his feet off the desk and leaned across and said, my experience is the war. I can tell you about the war.
When John Kennedy joined the Navy in 1941, he did not want to languish in some backwater stateside base. He wanted to be on the front line. After General Douglas MacArthur's daring escape from the Philippines aboard a PT boat, the Navy opened a school in Melville, Rhode Island, to train PT boat officers. Jack applied and was accepted to the elite program. The craft was relatively new in the Navy arsenal, with a reputation as the fighter plane of the sea. In reality, they were flimsy wooden hulls with huge engines and light armament. Melville's course lasted 3 months, and the graduates were called 90-day wonders. Almost always, they had no combat experience and were shipped straight to the front. But not Jack. After graduation, he was promoted to lieutenant, made a PT boat instructor, and sent to Florida.
He was assigned to take 3 PT boats going down the inland waterway to Florida. On the way down, they ran aground. It was cold then, and he wanted to find out what the bottom was like where they were aground. The thing that always appealed to me about what he did was the fact that rather than send somebody else over the side, he went over himself. He didn't say to the executive officer, you go over and look. He did it himself. And there were certain dangers in going over it. To me, it showed that he was a first-class officer in that he was not going to ask anybody to do what he wouldn't do himself.
Jack, however, didn't want to be a training officer. Repeatedly, he applied for combat duty, only to be denied. Pretty soon, his buddies called him Shafty because he kept getting the shaft. But Jack persisted, using family influence.
He wanted to get into the combat area where the real combat was, which was in the Solomons. Somehow or other, I think he went down to the Navy Department and prevailed upon them to assign him as a replacement officer.
In February of 1943, Jack got his wish. He received orders sending him to the front. 6 weeks later, he arrived in Guadalcanal on the day the Japanese launched their biggest aerial attack since Pearl Harbor. Ever the correspondent, Jack described his first combat experience to Lem Billings. The day I arrived, he wrote, they had a hell of an attack. As we were carrying fuel oil and bombs, and in a boat that was a tub, I thought we might withdraw and return at some later date. But the captain evidently thought he was in command of the North Carolina as he sailed right in. It was the start of a very interesting month. Soon after, he heard that his mother was praying for his safety. Jack wrote her, saying, "I hope it won't be taken as a sign of lack of confidence in you all, or the church, if I continue to duck." By his 26th birthday, Lieutenant Kennedy was in command of his own boat in the Solomon Islands, PT-109. Days were filled with endless boredom, but at night they went on patrol. For Jack, coming home was the most fun.
When you came home from a patrol, you'd just throw the throttles right to her and head for the barn, so to speak. And you'd run at quite high speed.
Fueled by his love of speed and sailing, Jack enjoyed racing other boats. This was not without mishap. At one point, he crashed his boat into the dock, and the men gave him a new nickname, Crash Kennedy. Jack's cavalier days as a torpedo boat captain came to an abrupt end on Monday, August 2nd. Early that morning, he was on patrol in Japanese-infested waters.
It was a horribly confused patrol that he was on. His commander was a very strange man. Just the fact that he wouldn't let the boats communicate with one another. They were forbidden to have any communication when they got out on their patrol station. And that was unheard of over where we were.
In the terrible confusion of battle, PT-109 was rammed by a Japanese destroyer, sliced in half.
What he did after that was, to me, was really outstanding. I mean, it was several acts of great heroism, keeping his crew together, getting them ultimately to an island. He just did a superlative job of holding that crew together.
Of the 13 men aboard the burning, sinking boat, only 2 died, a tribute to Jack's seamanship. He swam them to an island behind enemy lines, personally towing 1 injured man for miles. For 7 days, they survived on unripened coconuts, bugs, and the few drops of fresh water they could gather. Every night, Jack swam out into the channel, hoping to hail a passing patrol. Finally, they were rescued, only because Jack trusted some natives to deliver an SOS message carved on the shell of a green coconut. An Australian coast watcher received the coconut and sent word to the British, who wired the U.S. Navy, that 11 men from PT-109 were alive. Jack retrieved that coconut and kept it for the rest of his life.
He had it encased in plastic on his desk to look at it every day. And I suppose he thought, no matter how bad things may get at any time, I'm looking at that coconut, remembering when it was almost an impossible situation, not knowing from day to day if we were going to live.
Jack's personal courage could not be overstated, even by Hollywood 20 years later.
He had made 3 requests before the film was. One, that it be historically accurate, because Hollywood is sometimes inclined to exaggerate certainly heroic things. He didn't want it exaggerated, certainly not the bravery aspect. I think that embarrassed him a little bit. Second thing was that any monies that might be directed in his way, because it was about him, a story of his life, would be given to the crew of the PT-109. And the third, that he be allowed to pick the actor to play the role. He chose me. Probably one of the worst decisions in the 1,000 days in office he made.
Bravery aside, Jack's ordeal ruined his back, and his debilitating adrenal condition worsened, so the Navy sent him home. Mentally, he was sobered by the horror of war. When lauded and decorated as a hero, Jack told a reporter, "The real heroes are not the men who return, but those who stay out there, like plenty of them do, 2 of my men included." Before war's end, Jack felt the most horrible wrench of suffering, the loss of his own brother. In his quiet act of heroism, Navy pilot Joe Kennedy Jr. continued to fly dangerous missions over Europe well beyond his tour of duty. In August 1944, Joe volunteered for a secret operation, codenamed Anvil. While flying a bomb-laden B-24, his plane exploded. In the roar of a moment, Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr. was gone. The next month, Jack's brother-in-law was killed in France. Billy Cavendish, the Lord Hartington, had been married to Kathleen just 4 months. When Jack's Navy career ended in March of 1945, he felt his calling. He would take Joe's place and enter politics. The war had toughened his resolve. Jack had not been to Europe since 1939. When he arrived, he was shocked by the ruin and devastation. In Berlin, he wrote, "There is not a single building which is not gutted. On some of the streets, the stench, sweet and sickish from dead bodies, is overwhelming. The people all have completely colorless faces, a yellow tinge with pale tan lips. They are all carrying bundles. Where they are going, no one knows."
In that diary, he talks about the coming of the Cold War. He doesn't name it, of course, but talks about the coming difficulties with the Soviet Union. Then there's a strange strain of sympathy for Hitler, or at least the idea that he would emerge as one of the significant figures of history. Now, I think that was an echo of Joseph Kennedy.
Hitler, Jack wrote, had a mystery about him in the way that he lived and in the manner of his death that will live and grow after him. He had in him the stuff of which legends are made. Though Jack loved journalism, it was just a prelude to leadership.
He thought about journalism as a career. He enjoyed it. But then he realized he was a more serious man, I think, than many of his fellows thought he was, that newspaper reporters didn't make things happen. Even newspaper owners didn't make things happen. Politicians make things happen.
In 1946, Jack declared himself a candidate for office in the 11th Congressional District, representing Boston. The race became a family affair, with his 83-year-old grandfather campaigning as if he were the candidate. It was, after all, a seat Honey Fitz had once occupied. Jack's mother, brothers, and sisters also pitched in, but it was old Joe Kennedy who plotted strategy behind the scenes. Jack loved his father dearly, but couldn't stomach his methods. Against his father's advice, Jack refused to parlay a lost PT boat and a bad back into a political advantage. He ran on issues, strong against communism, high on government spending. And instead of touting his war record, he chose to elevate the true heroes. In Charlestown, Massachusetts, Jack met a group of Gold Star mothers, women who'd lost their sons in the war. Though uncomfortable at the podium, Jack won many votes when he told the women, "I think I know how all you mothers feel, because my mother is a Gold Star mother too." Jack won by a landslide, but his first term in Congress was hardly stellar.
It was a little disappointing to some of us. When he first went into Congress in 1946, we were worried because we didn't see him for a year and a half. He was in Florida a good deal of the time. He was sick. But his first term was a disaster.
Jack fell seriously ill in September 1947. His back grew worse, and his adrenal system was failing. Doctors said he wouldn't live another year. But there was a ray of hope, a steroid hormone called cortisone. That fall, he began treatments, and for the rest of his life, his father stockpiled cortisone in safe deposit boxes around the world. "1948 brought new cruelty. In May, Jack's sister, the irrepressible Kathleen, perished in a plane crash in Europe. Her death touched him deeply, and it was one of the few times anybody saw Jack cry. In the fall of 1948, Jack was re-elected to Congress. But what he really wanted was the U.S. Senate seat held by Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. Historically, it was an important office, once held by the great Daniel Webster. It was also a seat that Honey Fitz had once sought, only to be defeated by Lodge's powerful grandfather. A Kennedy victory would even the score. But John F. Honey Fitzgerald would never see that tribute. He died in October 1950. Focusing on the future, Jack and his close-knit team of political advisors, the Irish Mafia as they were called, put together a grueling 4-year plan to beat Lodge. It was only 1948, but Jack was already sprinting towards 1952. Again, the entire family joined the race. His father worked out of sight, but Jack's mother, sisters, and grandmother hosted 35 tea parties, conspicuously attended by 75,000 ladies of voting age. It was a very close race, but Jack won. Afterwards, the pundits called him the man who drowned Henry Cabot Lodge in 75,000 cups of tea.
Well, I guess you're glad it's over, aren't you, Bobby? I am, Jack. Okay.
At age 35, Senator Jack Kennedy was coming of age. He was the self-styled leader of a new generation. But equally significant, his bachelor days were coming to an end. She was beautiful, charming, well-read, well-traveled, Catholic, fluent in the Romance languages, studied the arts, understood history, and wanted children. For these reasons and more, Jacqueline Lee Bouvier was introduced to Jack Kennedy by a mutual friend in June of 1951.
She was a wonderful girl who'd been around this town, lived out here on McLean, Virginia, and I had the idea of introducing them. My wife and I would settle in Georgetown, and we had a little dinner, and we brought them together.
21-year-old Jackie was engaged to another man when she met Jack, but that didn't deter him.
This is a very, very attractive woman, and Jack was intrigued by her. He'd known a lot of attractive women in his life, but I think he felt it was time to get married, and this was a good idea.
Indeed, Jack had a playboy reputation, verified by a steady stream of quests and conquests, including Jean Tierney, the beautiful movie star. No one knew the political fallout of such dalliances better than Jack's father.
I think the old man said to him, he said, "Look, Jack, so they're going to start saying you're a fairy, or they're going to start, you're going to get caught in some situation." He said, "There's nothing but trouble down the road." He said, "You really should get married." I mean, Joe was always thinking of the build-up for the White House.
In May 1953, Jack let it slip that he was engaged to Jackie Bouvier. 4 months later came their storybook wedding. The Senator and Mrs. Kennedy honeymooned in California, but not for long. For Jack, 1954 was a lousy year. In the Senate, he voted for a bill that was good for the nation, but took work away from Boston Harbor, and he was ostracized. This got him thinking about other senators who'd made unpopular decisions. At the same time, Jack's back was so thoroughly ruined that he needed surgery. But his adrenal condition made the chances of surviving an operation just 50-50. Facing this, Jack told friends, "I'd rather be dead than spend the rest of my life on these goddamn crutches." He'd have the surgery and write a book about American political courage. Between October of 1954 and February of 1955, Jack had two major operations. Infections nearly killed him. Again, he was given the last rites, and again, he pulled through. His father said, "I know nothing can happen to him now, because I've stood by his deathbed 3 times, and each time I said goodbye to him, and each time he came back stronger." During recovery, Jack put his mind to work, thinking and writing about 8 U.S. senators who had defied popular opinion by voting their consciences. This cathartic endeavor was published January 1st, 1956. Jack called his book Profiles in Courage and dedicated it to Jackie. The book won critical acclaim as a bestseller, but more significantly, it won the Pulitzer Prize for biography. Jack was honored by the award, which validated his sense of history. But that honor turned to fury when Jack heard the vicious but false rumor that he was not the book's author. It was politically motivated slander, put quickly to rest. Profiles in Courage powered Jack's physical recovery, but his meteoric rise in national politics came later that summer at the Democratic Party convention of 1956. Broadcast live on the new medium of television, it was an exciting and historic event. Adlai Stevenson was nominated for president, but instead of choosing his running mate, he threw the vice presidency to the floor of the convention. On a lark, Jack put his name in the ring.
And I'm proud and happy to second the nomination of Senator John F. Kennedy, and I hope he'll be nominated.
On TV, Jack looked sure, confident, and dignified, and he came within a whisker of the nomination. Though he finished second to Estes Kefauver of Tennessee, Jack was the man in the spotlight. It was then he decided to go for the White House in 1960.
Jack said, he said, "I think I'll run for president in 1960. And I was outraged. I said, "Jack," I said, "you're too young." I said, your life has been sheltered. You know Palm Beach, Hyannisport, Boston. I said, "You don't know anything about this country." I said, "You're crazy to go for president now." I said, "Well, let it go for 8 years and see what happens." And he said, "Look," he said, "in this business," he said, "you go when you're hot."
Jack had spent his entire life envisioning himself on history's great stage. Now, Machiavellian fortune offered him the role he coveted, so he acted.
I am today announcing my candidacy for the presidency of the United States.
One day I was in talking to him, and I said, "Well, Senator, why do you want this? Why are you doing this? You don't have much of a record. You're looked on as a rich man's son, somewhat of a playboy. It seems to me that all disadvantages are on your side. Why do this?" And I remember he looked across the desk. He said, "Because I want it."
Aggressively, Jack confronted every attack against him. In Wisconsin, he beat the rich boy label by showing his blue-collar work ethic. Up before dawn, shaking hands at a rate of 1,000 an hour. Jackie was shocked by the bruises on his hands. Next was Protestant West Virginia. There he faced the Catholic issue. Old Joe advised him not to enter the primary, saying he would lose. Jack replied to his staff, "Well, we've heard from the ambassador, but we're going to go into West Virginia, and we're going to win." And he did, by a landslide. By July 1960, Jack had momentum that no one could stop, and he was nominated for president on the first ballot at the Democratic Party convention.
Mr. Chairman, Wyoming's vote will make a majority to Senator Kennedy. And I can assure all of you here who have reposed this confidence in me that I will be worthy of your trust. We will carry the fight
to the people in the fall, and we shall win.
But it's the first campaign that I ever covered, and I thought it was, I can't remember having more fun in my life. And the crowds, the Kennedy crowds were something else. There was an exuberance and an excitement about it that was very catching.
The entire Kennedy family joined the race. Jackie and 2-year-old daughter Caroline were out in front with Jack, projecting youth, beauty, and perfect family values. Rose and Jack's sisters were always by his side. And behind the scenes, Bobby ran the campaign. Jack's brother Ted had the impossible task of keeping tabs on their father, and nobody worked harder than old Joe Kennedy.
Ambassador Kennedy called me, and he said to me, I'd like you to help my son Johnny. That's what he called him, by the way. Never called him Jack. And he said, I chose you as a writer because you don't use a bludgeon, you use a stiletto between the 5th and 6th rib.
Jack respected his father's tactics and knew about the many backroom deals. The fact that old Joe was brokering votes in Illinois bothered Jack, but pragmatically he knew Nixon was doing the same thing. Jack, however, concentrated on the one thing his father couldn't teach him: how to look and act like a president.
He was fascinated with how do you move people? What do you say? What are the phrases? What are the gestures? We had a big discussion once in the campaign of '60, he and I, about what gesture he should use. What should he do with his hands when he's talking?
In September and October of 1960, Jack put his skills to a test in 4 historic television debates.
Abraham Lincoln was a great president of all the people, but he was selected by his party at a key time in history because his party stood for something.
Though technically a draw, Jack won all the style points. He looked presidential on TV, while Nixon looked bad.
America has not been standing still, but America cannot stand pat. We can't stand pat.
Jack refused to attack his opponent personally. They had been good friends in the Congress, but privately, he felt strongly about the grim figure of Richard Nixon.
He'd said to me, this thing started as a lark, but I've got to win it. It's a holy grail now because Nixon hasn't got any class. I can't leave America to him.
America heard the candidates, went to the polls, and elected a new leader. On November 8th, 1960, John Fitzgerald Kennedy became the 35th President of the United States. And by doing so, Jack fulfilled his late brother's destiny. The days preceding Jack's inauguration were thrilling. The promise of so much youth entering the White House fascinated people. Outside Jack's Georgetown residence, the press hovered like pigeons on the sidewalk, feeding off Kennedy tidbits.
It was like carnival time. Most of the time, we didn't know what was going to happen next, but every time the door opened, we thought there'd be another cabinet officer announced, because a lot of them were announced right on that doorstep.
Not since the days of Abraham Lincoln was a presidential cabinet so diverse, so intellectual, so dedicated. It was also controversial. Jack's father wanted his 7th child, Robert Francis Kennedy, to be Attorney General of the United States. Bobby was tough on crime and tougher on scandal. He would keep the administration clean. "I want Bobby there," the ambassador told Jack. "It's the only thing I'm asking, and I want it."
He said that when he announced his brother, Bobby, as Attorney General, he was going to do it at 2 o'clock in the morning and just stick his head out and say it's Bobby and slam the door. I don't think he did it.
Besides the heady political crumbs, the pigeons waited for other news.
Mrs. Kennedy also was very pregnant, and we didn't know when the baby was going to come.
John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr. arrived on November 25th, 1960, and the family called him John John. When Jack was asked if he wanted his son to grow up to be president, he replied, "I just want him to be healthy."
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Coldest day in the history of the world. Big snowfall beforehand, and the temperature was down around zero somewhere.
It started out to be an absolute disaster, but turned out to be, because of the snowstorm that hit Washington, really kind of wonderful. And then the marvelous address.
The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
I just thought it was a great speech the moment I heard it. It didn't need anyone else to move me. I felt it. I felt that speech. It was powerful. It was commanding. And it just started to define the times for all of us.
After the speech came the parade, an extravaganza, including a replica of PT-109. That evening, Jack attended no fewer than 10 inaugural balls and parties and didn't get to his new home until after midnight. The next day, he wandered around the White House with the enthusiasm of a schoolboy, bouncing on the Lincoln bed and checking out the furniture. Some were antiques. Other pieces, Jack thought, might have come from Sears. Jackie recognized the need to refurbish, and that became her genius as First Lady. But Jack's attention was immediately diverted by the confounding tug of the Oval Office. At first, he was rather cavalier. When told that African diplomats traveling between New York and Washington were not allowed to use restaurants and restrooms along the interstate highway in segregated Maryland, Jack suggested they fly. Then, the Freedom Riders challenged segregation laws throughout the South. Hundreds of youths in chartered buses demanding civil rights in Dixie. In Alabama, it reached a burning climax. Jack had to do something.
That was the decision that John Kennedy never, ever wanted to make. When he was talking on people to liberate themselves, he really meant that message for Czechoslovakia or for Hungary or East Germany, never realizing the impact those same words were having on young, particularly young, black Americans. And Kennedy was asking everyone, why is this happening? Why is this happening? One person said it's because they think they're doing it for you.
The civil rights question opened Jack's eyes. Eventually, he would use government force to suppress bigotry. But the first decision he wanted to make was the Peace Corps. On March 1st, 1961, Jack issued his first executive order, creating a peacetime army of young, enthusiastic American volunteers to spread the fruit of liberty to the poorest corners of the world.
I think certainly the ringing theme of ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. I mean, that almost became a direct translation into the Peace Corps.
On the day of its creation, Jack greeted Indian Prime Minister Nehru in Washington. Proudly, he asked the great leader what he thought of the Peace Corps. Nehru said that privileged young Americans would learn a lot from impoverished Indian villagers. It was a painful but honest dig, and it illuminated Jack's early lessons as president.
He had quite a series of crises in 1961. People forget that. It was a learning time. Joe Kennedy said he was lucky. He got all the lessons in 1 year.
Jack's first lesson was the Bay of Pigs, an ill-thought hangover from the Eisenhower administration. Despite better judgment, Jack approved the CIA-backed invasion of Cuba, and it failed miserably. Feeling betrayed by those he did not trust and determined to rescue his presidency, Jack did what he had to do.
In retrospect, I think he turned the corner by admitting he was wrong, by taking the blame. His popularity went up to 80% after that. I mean, that's very unusual in this town. You don't see that all the time.
After that, Jack laughed. "Jesus," he said, "it's just like Ike. The worse you do, the better they like you." Following the Bay of Pigs, Jack was compelled to do something big, something to mark his place in history.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
I personally, and I think most of the other astronauts at that time, thought it was a very ambitious schedule. And we'd be very fortunate if we made it on that time frame, but we were willing to tie into it and do our level best.
That was so exciting. All of those astronauts came, and the president was like a little kid because he was excited to meet them as we were excited to meet them. Those were wonderful days when the original astronauts came to the White House.
He was interested in what we were going to do, not just that we were going into space and going to be up there going around. He was interested far more in the real details of exactly what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, what equipment I had on board. And it wasn't just a passing interest to be courteous because I happened to be there briefing him either. He was really interested in the details of it.
In February 1962, after John Glenn orbited the Earth in Friendship 7, Jack went to Florida to greet the astronaut and brought him back to Washington to give a speech to Congress.
This morning, coming up from Florida on the plane with President Kennedy, we had the opportunity to meet Mrs. Kennedy and Caroline before we took off. I think Caroline really cut us down to size and put us back in our proper position, though, when after being introduced, she looked up and said, "Where's the monkey?"
It was a 10-year operation, and this was the key problem that he had with it. You mean to tell me I've got to spend $40 billion, take 10 years, and you can't guarantee me that we'll get to the moon ahead of the Russians? And nobody could. They thought so, thought they could do it. But it was a big risk. But again, I think Kennedy heard voices. Said, this is going to be big in history. This is fascinating. I like the idea. Let's go for it.
Back on Earth, there was nothing romantic about Jack's fight against organized crime, his struggles with U.S. Steel, nor the brewing storm in Southeast Asia. But these demands were lightened by the festive atmosphere of the White House. Never had the arts and the world of entertainment enjoyed more attention from a president. In truth, it was all about history. Jack thought of his administration in historical terms, how it would be remembered, how he would be remembered. Jack knew better than most that every president had his defining moment. Jack's arrived in October of 1962. Spy photos showed Russian missile sites in communist Cuba. Jack had few options: invade Cuba, bomb the island, or run a Navy blockade. Any one of these could result in nuclear war. Jack was not afraid for himself. He had faced death so many times in his life. As a baby, as a boy, as a cocky teenager, as a wise young man, he was comfortable with his own mortality. But he had finally found something beautiful in his life: his children. And he was afraid for them. He was afraid for all children. As Jack considered his options, he felt the tug of all humanity.
The president cared so deeply about what was going to happen to the world, and he was really concerned that it could lead to World War III with those missiles headed over with Khrushchev on the ship. In those days, when you would see the president in his office or walking down towards the pool area in that West Wing, he looked so tired and so Wayne and very, very concerned about what would happen, and yet he had the courage to make that decision that those missiles would be turned around.
I had been sitting outside the cabinet room door for 8 or 9 days waiting for an opportunity to make some kind of a historic collection of pictures of this event because it was, so important. At a proper time, I was allowed in, and the proper time was when the heat was off and they were preparing their press release for the announcement that Khrushchev had backed down. And now these are the only pictures that were made of that event when the president was successful in his eyeball confrontation.
At the conclusion of the crisis, Jack could joke about it. He had prevailed and earned the trust of the American people. So Jack began to think ahead to the great endeavors of his second term. "1,000 days into his presidency, Jack was a happy man. His vision was clear, his goals within reach. After surviving the Cuban Missile Crisis, he truly believed that he and the American people could accomplish anything, even world peace. What's more, Jack had the people of the world believing. 1963 was a travel year for Jack, and everywhere he went, he inspired people. In Latin America, he forged an alliance for progress. In Berlin, he appeared by the oppressive wall that separated East from West, standing on the side of freedom.
Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is, Ich bin ein Berliner.
He also visited Ireland and received the welcome due a king.
There is an impression in Washington that there are no Kennedys left in Ireland, that they're all in Washington. And so I wonder if there are any Kennedys in this audience. Could you hold up your hand so I can see? Oh, I'm glad to see a few cousins who didn't catch the boat. We're glad.
I was on the Irish leg of the trip, which I shall remember all the days of my life. Everywhere he went, the crowds were enormous, waiting to greet him. Then as he left to go on the plane, he said, "I'll be back in the springtime." Well, of course, he never was back in the springtime.
Over Labor Day, Jack visited his mother and father on Cape Cod. 75-year-old Joe Kennedy, crippled by a stroke in 1961, loved to sit on the porch and watch Jack's helicopter land on his front lawn.
The weekend would start with him arriving Friday afternoon by helicopter, and the helicopter would land just outside the ambassador's door, literally 50 feet away. And then Monday morning, he'd go back to work. And in this case, he came over and fondly kissed him on his head as he went away.
Early in November, Jack relaxed with Jackie and the children at their new home in the gentle horse country of Virginia. Jack didn't like horses, but thought he might settle here after retirement. Before Thanksgiving, Jack went to Texas to patch up a Democratic Party feud before the re-election campaign began. He was excited about the trip, not because he liked Texas barbecue, which he didn't, but because he loved promoting his space program, which he did at the opening of a new aerospace facility in San Antonio.
This nation has tossed its cap over the wall of space, and we have no choice but to follow it. With the help and support of all Americans, we will climb this wall with safety and with speed, and we shall then explore the wonders on the other side. Thank you.
Jack had another speech in his pocket, a better one, to give the next day in Dallas.
I was in that first press bus kind of leaning against the window, and Kennedy's car had gone up in front of us and turned so it was out of sight. It had gone down by the grassy knoll when I heard the sounds. And it was bang, bang, bang.
First thing that Bobby Kennedy asked was the last thing he wanted to hear. He said, "Is it Jack?" And I never forgot that because it showed that was so typical of his courage. Just tell me, I want to know. And of course, a part of him died that day, as a part of everyone in the president's family, and I think everyone associated with that administration.
I covered the funeral 4 days, unending. Everybody covered it between tears and, trying to do your job. I think that everybody was so saddened. The world seemed to stand still.
Kennedy came up with the idea, as the world now knows, to have the eternal flame, which was unheard of in our country, the eternal flame at the cemetery. She paid her husband such great homage and such honor.
I think the wonder of his presidency was how he still managed to create this sense of excitement, this sense of hope, this sense of confidence that the country could have in itself and should have in itself.
I think his greatest achievement, the greatest Kennedy achievement, was his instilling a sense of the positive achievement of government, the fact that there was an opportunity for government to lead, invent, guide, and make a better country.
You know, prior to that time, there had been talk about whether I would run for public office, and I had decided not to do that. After President Kennedy was killed, I sort of reassessed my position and responsibilities to the country, as a lot of people did at that time, and decided I would run.
In Dallas, on the 6th floor of the old school book depository building, people visit a museum dedicated to the last day of Jack's life. In a memory book, they write notes to him.
As I retraced your last moment on this earth, a lump in my throat and tears in my eyes are my only goodbye. I do feel a slight bit more complete now, as if perhaps I've met you finally after all these years of legacy and have had a chance at farewell.
Had Jack lived one more day, he would have given a speech at the Dallas Trade Mart luncheon, his planned destination that fateful autumn afternoon. Jack always had a speech in his pocket, whether it was just the right quip at the right time or the perfect moment to make a righteous call. This speech was one he'd saved for the moment. We in this country, in this generation, are, by destiny rather than choice, the watchmen on the walls of world freedom. We ask, therefore, that we may be worthy of our power and responsibility, that we may exercise our strength with wisdom and restraint, and that we may achieve in our time and for all time the ancient vision of peace on earth, goodwill toward men.
With his ambition and intelligence, Joe Kennedy conquered Wall Street, then Hollywood, and finally Washington. And with his charm and good looks, he conquered women at every stop along the way. Among them, the world's most desirable starlet. As biography reveals, Joe Kennedy was determined to have everything: wealth, respect, and the most powerful family in America. And what Joe Kennedy wanted, he got.
Loving husband and father, uncompromising patriarch, calculating opportunist, philanderer, philanthropist, Wall Street shark, bootlegger, movie producer, public servant, kingmaker, adored grandfather. Joseph P. Kennedy was complex, contradictory, and controversial. He had the ear of a president, the blessings of a pope. He socialized with kings, a bevy of beautiful queens, and some of the biggest names in movies, finance, and government. He had political aspirations and longed to be the first Catholic president of the United States. When his own political dreams were dashed by remarks he made during the dark days of World War II, he deliberately moved into the background, turned to his sons, and used his great fortune to create a political dynasty, the effects of which will be felt into the 21st century, and perhaps beyond.
He was a very, very strong person who had the kind of unique judgment that you can almost feel as a earth force in his personality.
Joseph P. Kennedy, my grandfather, was an extraordinary figure. The whole world was open to him. He was filled with determination and energy and a great sense of a future that he was going to create for himself, clearly, making money, doing well in business, but then understanding that a real joy in life is doing something for your kids.
As a child, I used to tell my little classmates that the most important men in the world was the Holy Father, the Pope, and Mr. Roosevelt, who was our president, and my Uncle Joe.
Joseph P. Kennedy was the source from which what was later called Camelot sprang. But his ancestors were not kings and queens. They were hard-working Irish immigrants. Joe's grandfather, Patrick Joseph Kennedy, left Ireland in 1849 to seek a better life in America. There are tales of a shipboard romance.
According to oral history in the family, he met on board a lovely colleen by the name of Bridget Murphy. And Bridget was a little bit older than Patrick, but they fell in love. And when they landed here, they were married in Boston and started their family.
Patrick died just 9 years later on November 22nd, 1858. He left behind a penniless wife and 4 children, 3 girls and 1 boy named Patrick Joseph. Bridget Murphy Kennedy was determined that her family would survive the slums of East Boston. She found work as a maid, enslaved for meager wages, and saved her money.
Her one son, PJ, she sends him to parochial school. She gives him the money that he uses to buy a tavern. That's the beginning of the whole dynasty. So the family's founded on a woman's money. PJ Kennedy then marries up, which is the family pattern. He marries Mary Augusta Hickey, who is a educated, very religious woman.
As a saloon keeper, PJ is a figure of great importance to the Irish Catholic worker. He became their ward boss, and his influence and wealth increased. He bought into a second saloon and a whiskey distributorship. His political star was shining bright. He was elected to the state senate in 1884. PJ's wife, Mary Augusta, gave birth to a son, Joseph Patrick Kennedy, on September the 6th, 1888, at the family home. Mary Augusta named him Joseph because she thought Joseph sounded more American. She expected nothing less than greatness from him.
Joe, being the firstborn, being beloved really by both of his parents, became the object of all that hope. So she was the one who wanted him to go to the best schools, to do well, to become something. So he had not only the kind of dignity that his father represented, but the drive that his mother represented to push him forward.
Joe learned early on that his broad smile and his exuberant charm opened more doors than academic achievements. He attended Boston Latin, one of the top schools. He was extremely popular, president of his class, colonel of the drill team, and an outstanding baseball player. He had the highest batting average as a Boston schoolboy in his senior year and won the John Fitzgerald Cup, presented, of course, by his future father-in-law, Honey Fitz himself, the colorful mayor of Boston. Joe won the cup and would later win the hand of the mayor's beloved daughter, Rose Elizabeth. Joe was admitted to Harvard in 1908. Some say that his father's money and political connections may have helped, and he continued to court Rose. Honey Fitz didn't approve of Joe as a suitor. He had another young man in mind for his daughter, so Rose had a secret and sweet romance with Joe.
She remembered wonderful walks that they would take through Harvard Yard together. On the steps of University Hall, she would meet him. They would walk through the yard, past the statues. They would go to Mount Auburn Cemetery and just would feel that sense of being a young couple in love. And she said she remembered even that she thought that other people saw them as a young couple in love, that sense of just enjoying being young and loving somebody. And Joe was determined that he would win her. And I think once he was determined for something like that, there was no question he was going to do it, and he did.
Joe was popular at Harvard and was tapped in his sophomore year by the Institute of 1770, which led to membership in the Hasty Pudding Club. The final and most prestigious club was waiting, the Porcellian. No Catholic had ever been asked to join. Joe waited all day in his room to hear, and in the gathering darkness, finally, it sank in. He would not be accepted.
He was not invited into those elite clubs. He was not invited into their social gatherings, and that hurt him. And he wanted to best them, and he wanted to get out in that world and be everything that be their equal.
The rejection by the Porcellian Club had an extraordinary impact on him. It was as if something had been torn from his innocence. He became hardened and would never again fully trust an institution. A new Joseph P. Kennedy was born, one who would show the Brahmins and who would leave his mark on the world for years to come. Joseph P. Kennedy graduated from Harvard in 1912. Determined to find his own way, he went into banking instead of politics. He summed it up by saying, "If you want to make money, go where the money is." And as to a life in politics, because he had seen others suffer great setbacks, Joe said, "It doesn't make any difference how high a young man may rise in politics, nor how brilliant his future may seem. His ultimate defeat is inevitable." Joe took a job with the Columbia Trust Company as a clerk. It was a small bank, and his father was one of the founders. Later, Joe learned the intricacies of banking as a bank examiner and became highly respected in financial circles. When the threat of a hostile takeover presented itself to Columbia Trust, Joe moved swiftly to save the small institution that had rescued so many East Boston working-class men in their time of need. Joe raised $100,000 from his father and assorted uncles. and an additional $15,000 from Eugene Thayer, the president of the Merchants National Bank of Boston. Columbia was saved, and as his reward, Joe was elected president of the trust company. At 25, he was the youngest bank president in the United States.
Most young men at 25 were just beginning to court seriously the young lady of their choice, and this young man had already chosen Rose and was on his way towards going up.
Joe proposed to Rose. He knew there was no way Honeyfitz could stand in the way of the youngest bank president in the United States. On June 13, 1914, the mayor of Boston announced the engagement of his daughter, Rose Elizabeth, to Joseph P. Kennedy. And on October 7, 1914, they were married by William Cardinal O'Connell in a private ceremony in his chapel. After 3 idyllic weeks at the Greenbrier Hotel in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, the young couple returned to a modest home, sitting in a heavily middle-class Protestant neighborhood in Brookline, Massachusetts. The first and favorite son, Joe Jr., made his appearance on July 25, 1915. Joe Jr.'s father beamed, but no one was prouder than grandfather Honeyfitz, who held the boy on high and proclaimed that Joe Jr. would be President of the United States. Joe Sr. smiled and wholeheartedly agreed. World War I had begun in 1914, and Joe was an outspoken proponent of isolationism. He thought that there were no heroics in vain, glorious acts which led to death. To Joe, family was the most important thing in the world, and his children were the center of the universe. His second son, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was born on May 29, 1917, and America entered the war that same year. Joe's classmates from Harvard marched off, but Joe remained behind with a management job in shipbuilding, which granted him deferred status. Later, some called him a draft dodger. Rosemary Kennedy was born on September the 13th, 1918, and the war ended on November the 11th. Joe resumed his climb to the dizzy and exhilarating top of the financial ladder. The Roaring Twenties began with the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the sale of alcohol. For Joe, it began with the birth of his daughter, Kathleen, on February 20th, 1920, and the new position he had taken with the Boston brokerage firm of Hayden, Stone & Company. His coup d'etat came in 1924, when he locked himself up in a set of Waldorf Astoria suites with a bank of phones, an automatic ticker tape, and his now full-time secretary and confidant, Edward Moore. Given the green light and the money needed by John Hertz, owner of the Yellow Cab Company, Joe moved to stop the raiders who were causing yellow cab stock to decline. He manipulated yellow cab stock on a colossal scale, buying and selling it from brokerage houses throughout the country, totally confusing the rival checker cab company and causing them to retire from the field, frayed and badly burned. When he emerged from his suites more than a month later, he had the undying gratitude of John Hertz, who rewarded Joe with large sums of cash and stocks in his various companies. One would become Hertz Rent-A-Car. Joe had been in a hotel room for almost 7 weeks. His baby Pat had been born, and he hadn't even seen her. Eunice had been born in 1921, and now, with the birth of Patricia, the Kennedy children totaled 6.
Aunt Rose said one time, because he made $1 million in the beginning for each child. And Aunt Rose said, oh, well, I really don't know. I'm just soon stop having babies. And if you would just stop making money. And he said, Rose, I can't seem to. And so that was it. I mean, it just multiplied and multiplied. Whatever he touched turned to gold. He had the Midas touch.
And so, in 1925, Robert Francis Kennedy was born. And in 1926, Joe tried his Midas touch with Hollywood. He purchased film booking offices called FBO, which would later merge with RKO Pictures. Though Joe had a deep appreciation of classical music, which he had studied at Harvard, he didn't pretend to be an artist when it came to making movies.
So he thought, if I can bring my business talent to that world of Hollywood, it'll give me a certain glamour, and at the same time, I'm going to make money. And so he did. He made a lot of money from making these B-quality films that were not very expensive to make, and that did then turn a profit for him.
The New York Times called Joe the Napoleon of cinema. He earned a reputation as a mogul who really understood the business side of the business. Nothing seemed to slow him down. What stopped Joe with a jolt was the premier movie presence of the time, the great star of the silver screen, Gloria Swanson. She was the most glamorous actress of the age, the screen beauty supreme, admired and imitated around the world. She and Joe met over lunch in 1927. She asked him to straighten out her badly mismanaged production company, and he agreed to do it. Ultimately, they formed a new film company called Gloria Productions Incorporated. And it was probably inevitable that a romance would develop between these two highly charged people.
Joseph Kennedy goes out to Hollywood to be a Hollywood mogul, to make films. And he's living out there with Gloria Swanson, one of the leading actresses of her time. And Mr. Kennedy saw that he could have it both ways. He could be the model of American family life, and he could have him be a man with a gorgeous mistress living with her in Hollywood.
The newspapers and magazines carried stories of Joe and Gloria, hinting at the possibility of a romance.
Meeting Gloria Swanson, which started originally from simply helping her out with her financial doings, she had gotten into a big mess, evidently, became, I think, for him, the next step up in that search for prestige, not prestige so much, but glamour, for celebrity. And she must have represented to him, unlike Rose, a liberated woman, and I have no doubt that they had some sort of a relationship.
If Rose suspected that Joe was unfaithful, she remained inscrutable.
Was Uncle Joe a womanizer? Well, he loved beautiful things. And if that helps anybody to understand him, well, then fine.
Joe's attempt to make a great picture ended in a debacle. After spending over $800,000 on a picture called Queen Kelly, and enduring the fanaticism of director Erich von Stroheim and the breakdown of Gloria Swanson, he halted all future production on the picture. On May 18, 1929, Joe's beloved father, P.J., died, as Joe grappled with the shambles of his movie in California. He made the decision not to return for the funeral. He rationalized that a train would never get him there in time for the service. That decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. Joe began to disassociate himself with Hollywood and returned to his family. The crash of '29 came on the last Tuesday in October, Black Tuesday. Joe found himself in the enviable position of having sensed that the wipeout was coming. He had slowly sold off most of his stocks and now began to buy and sell short. It was betting that the market would go lower, and it did. The Great Depression had begun. While overinflated businessmen who had bought on margin began throwing themselves out of office windows, Joe was at home, making millions in his suburban Bronxville estate, which he had purchased for $250,000. Finally, the main residences were the estate in New York, a winter residence in Palm Beach, Florida, and the home most associated with the Kennedys, the compound at Hyannisport, Massachusetts. Joe remained a lone wolf in business. His mistrust of all institutions grew out of his negative social experiences at Harvard. In his time, Joe Kennedy's name, in fact or fiction, was linked to many enterprises, legal and illegal. His myth could be likened to the Great Gatsby. In the Roaring '20s, many thought he was a bootlegger with connections to the mob because he had access to a seemingly never-ending supply of illegal but premium Scotch whiskey.
Well, Joe Kennedy was not a bootlegger. That would be my greatest joy, is if I could finally make people understand that. His father ran a liquor importation company. P.J. Kennedy and Company importers belonged to his dad. All he had to do was go to the warehouses or the storerooms under the houses in East Boston and Winthrop and get the best Scotch. The idea of Uncle Joe in a rowboat rowing to the Canadian shore to make a deal with a mafiosa for poisonous bathtub gin is so absurd you don't know Joe Kennedy if you think he was doing that.
Later, after the death of his father, Joe set up his own distributorship and called it Somerset Importers. That name, no doubt, was a subtle slam at the elite Bostonian Somerset Club, which denied admittance to Catholics. His daughter Jean was born in February of 1928, and in February of 1932, Rose, who was then almost 42 years old, presented Joe with a final child, Edward Moore Kennedy. He was called Teddy and was named for Joe's lifelong secretary and confidant, Eddie Moore.
She once told me that on the birth of each child, Uncle Joe gave her a spectacular piece of jewelry. She said, when he presented me with a lovely piece of jewelry on Teddy's birth, I said, darling, I have quite a collection now, and that's it. My jewelry box needs no more.
His family was complete, and most of his fortune was made. And Joe realized that with the Depression, there had been a power shift in the country. Real power would now come from Washington, and reversing an earlier position he had made concerning politics, he jumped into Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt's camp, endorsing him for president. FDR promised to save the country with ambitious government-backed work projects, the New Deal.
Joe Kennedy was not a Democrat because he was particularly liberal in his sentiments. He was a Democrat and a Roosevelt Democrat because he wanted to protect what he had. And he felt with the Depression that unless something was done, unless there were these social programs, there would be revolution and he would lose everything.
An anxious country awaited the beginning of the 1932 campaign. Franklin Roosevelt and Herbert Hoover were on a collision course, and Joe Kennedy wanted to be there to help pick up the pieces of a broken nation. Joe was invited to join FDR's whistle-stop campaign of '32. The 13,000-mile trip was one of the most uplifting events of his life. He experienced a camaraderie with his fellow campaigners that he had never felt with his classmates at Harvard. Joe had raised $150,000 for the campaign and had personally donated $50,000 and hoped to be rewarded with a high-ranking job in the administration. FDR was campaigning for the presidency. Joe was campaigning for the survival of capitalism. Roosevelt won in a landslide, but was slow to give Joe a reward. Joe dreamed of being Secretary of the Treasury. The breaking news story in the summer of 1934 was that the president would appoint Joseph P. Kennedy as chairman of the newly formed Security and Exchange Commission, a commission that would police Wall Street and make illegal many of the tactics that Joe himself had used in the past. Friends and foes alike thought Roosevelt had lost his mind. The president supposedly laughed and responded, "It takes a crook to catch a crook."
When Roosevelt chose him as first chairman of the SEC, a lot of people were appalled. The reality was, here was this man who knew exactly how people got away with things, and he was the perfect man to put through the laws that would make a more equitable system.
Joe served only 14 months on the SEC, but by the time he resigned, sweeping reforms were in place on Wall Street, and loopholes were closed, which assured that a Black Tuesday would never happen again. Joe won accolades, even from his sternest critics.
In a very short time, Kennedy did an excellent job with the SEC, and that is part of his legacy.
When Joe Kennedy became the commissioner of the SEC, people thought it would be a terrible job for him because he'd be like a fox in the chicken coop, but it turned out to be his finest hour in public service.
When it was done, his work at the SEC, he said to Rose, "If I never do anything else, I have finally truly served my country."
Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected to a second term by another landslide and pressed Joe into service again in 1937, this time as head of the Maritime Commission. His job was to rescue the antiquated merchant marine.
There is no doubt that the American people need an adequate merchant marine, nor is there any doubt that the American people are going to have an adequate merchant marine. We are going to lay the keels for new fast ships, and we're going to do it now. There is no doubt.
Kennedy addressed the American people in an optimistic cadence, which in later years would be associated with a young president.
And we wish to keep it free.
The great reward for the entire Kennedy family came in December of 1937, when President Roosevelt appointed Joe ambassador to England.
The ambassadorship to the court of St. James was the perfect plum for him. What it represented was the first Irish Catholic to be in that English court of St. James. So it answered all of those feelings that he'd had all those years about not really being able to be in the inside corridors of power.
But what about the family of 9, Mr. Kennedy?
Well, not wishing to add to the housing problem of England and make it any worse than it is, I'm bringing them over in installments. 5, 2, and 2.
The British press responded enthusiastically and anxiously awaited the arrival of the entire Kennedy clan. They didn't have to wait for long.
This is my first trip to Europe, and I was very excited. I couldn't even sleep last night.
The beginning was a time filled with excitement and promise. The ladies were presented at court. Joe and Rose became friends with the king and queen. Joe received honorary degrees from the University of Dublin and Cambridge. The Kennedy children were almost treated as American royalty. Joe quipped to Rose, "This is a hell of a long way from East Boston." And then, an honor almost beyond belief, Ambassador and Mrs. Kennedy and family represented the United States at the coronation of Pope Pius XII.
It was amazing that the Kennedys were there. That was a triumph. And the other triumph was that they were a Catholic family. And with the new Pope going to Rome and meeting with the Pope, having a private audience, what could have been more extraordinary than that? And they were at the absolute height of their power and their prestige, never dreaming that that was the beginning of the end.
The dark clouds of war hung in the air over Europe. Joe, in an address delivered on Trafalgar Day, said, "We may have to coexist with dictatorships whether we like it or not." He continued to take missteps that a more seasoned diplomat would have avoided. But all the wealth in the world could not stop the inevitability of events that exploded in 1939. Germany attacked Poland. England and France declared war on Germany. Joe said the ultimate defeat of England was all but a certainty and urged the United States to stay out.
Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy returns from England for the holidays, none too optimistic about conditions overseas. A frank diplomat is he.
After all, there are two terrible dilemmas in Europe: economic chaos and war. And anything that can keep us out of either of those should be tried.
Joe returned to England and remained until 1940. He witnessed the bombing of London and admired the courage of the British people, but still urged the United States to keep their neutrality. He was labeled an appeaser. Back home again, he tried to defend his position.
If I am called an appeaser because I oppose the entrance of this country into the present war, I cheerfully plead guilty. And so must every one of you who want to keep America out of this war. I have a great stake in this country. My wife and I have given 9 hostages to fortune. Our children and your children are more important than anything else in the world.
In late 1940, bowing to presidential pressure, Joe submitted his resignation.
Had it been a time of peace, he might have been an okay ambassador. He was good with trade negotiations. He was very relaxed as an ambassador over there, very unstuffy compared to previous ambassadors, so they liked him very much in the first year or so. But once that war came, it needed a sophisticated diplomatic person over there who understood history, understood men, and could judge men like Hitler, Churchill, and Chamberlain. Joe Kennedy had none of those qualities that allowed him to do that. And as a result, by tempting the fates and taking this job that was really beyond him, he destroyed his own upward mobility and brought his own career to an end.
On December 7th, 1941, the world was at war. The United States had been attacked by the Empire of Japan. And soon Joe's oldest sons, Joe Jr. and Jack, were in the service. Joe was proud but anxious. At the end of his career, he had invested all his hopes and aspirations in his oldest son. That son would be the first Catholic president of the United States. Joe would see to that when the war was won, and Joe Jr. would be safe at home. November the 12th, 1944. The unthinkable happened. Joe Jr. had volunteered to fly a Navy bomber laden with high explosives onto a missile site. He didn't have to fly again. He had completed his tour of duty and was eligible to return home. But he was a Kennedy. He and his co-pilot were to parachute to safety, but the explosives on their plane detonated prematurely, and both were killed and disappeared forever over the English Channel. His family was at the very core of Joe's existence, and now hated war had claimed the dynamic life of his firstborn son.
I could hear Uncle Joe heaving with sobs. I mean, the chest and everything. I had never heard a man cry. But he was devastated, and I think he felt that his sister Loretta was the only one he could do this with, because Rose would insist that he be terribly brave for the other children.
He loved that child. They had a very close relationship. And I think when he died, what one understands is that it was a blow unlike any that people had ever seen administered to any person. He was almost in shock.
Joe Kennedy was suffering. The hope of his life was gone. He felt he would never recover. Joseph Patrick Kennedy's beloved son was dead. A hero, killed in action, never to return. John F. Kennedy, who survived the war in the South Pacific, was now the oldest. He walked lonely on the beach at Hyannisport, waiting for his father to rally. Finally, Joe turned to his second son and invested his hopes for the future in him. The torch was passed. Joe remained discreetly out of sight when Jack made a bid for his first political office, Boston's 11th congressional seat. Grandpa Honeyfitz was highly visible in the campaign, but Joe was the mastermind behind the scenes. Jack won in a landslide, and once again, visions of the first Catholic president sparkled in the mind of Joe Kennedy. And then, on May 13th, 1948, tragedy struck again. His beloved daughter, Kathleen, was killed in the crash of a chartered plane on her way to meet with her father on the French Riviera.
Kathleen was the favorite child. When she died, it was a blow probably second only to the blow that he suffered when Joe Jr. died. He'd been very close to her and had a real tie to this vivacious, spirited young girl. And then she, in a certain sense, was tempting the fates by getting on a plane when she wasn't supposed to get on the plane, when the airplanes were not flying because there was such a terrible storm. And she wanted to meet her father to tell her about somebody she'd fallen in love with. So she dies in that crash. And again, that set him back for months on end. But once again, he rallied those forces because Jack was out there as the hope of the future.
Jack was the once and future king, but in every campaign, Joe was there behind the scenes, pulling the strings, giving advice, calling in political favors due, and making his great fortune available to his son. Jack was on the move, from the House of Representatives to the Senate, and then the seemingly unobtainable seemed possible. The presidency itself was in sight. January 2nd, 1960.
I am today announcing my candidacy for the presidency of the United States.
It's the dreams of many parents and many fathers that one of their sons would be president of the United States. That was Joseph P. Kennedy's dream, and he was going to make one of his sons that, whichever one it was, and it eventually became John F. Kennedy. That was his greatest dream.
And the dream came true. Jack defeated Richard Nixon in a race that was almost too close to call. He was the youngest man ever elected to that high office, and the first Catholic president in the history of the United States. Joe Kennedy was vindicated. The Brahmins of Boston faded away into the snow, which fell on the Capitol on the eve of Inauguration Day. Washington was crystallized in ice, crisp and cold, and blanketed in deep snow. There was a feeling of magic about the city as it glistened in the morning sun. Perhaps it was then that the idea of Camelot began. The words of the young president rang out through the icy air.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this...
Joe tipped his hat to his son, and in an extraordinary gesture of respect and love, the young president stood and tipped his hat to his father, then rode off into the brilliant sunlight. The triumph was short-lived. On December 19th, 1961, on a golf course in Palm Beach, Florida, less than a year after his son became president of the United States, Joseph P. Kennedy suffered a massive stroke. He would live on for almost 9 years in a crippled body, unable to speak but for one word, no. Yet aware that history was continuing to unfold about him.
Even after his terrible stroke, his mind was so clear, and everyone that dealt with him and that knew him understood how alive he continued to be.
Joseph P. Kennedy was definitely in there. It was, many people thought he was a vegetable, that he wasn't aware of what was going on. it wasn't the case. You sensed it because when Rose was there, she spoke of events of the day. She spoke of books she had read, and he was interested. He was very interested in all different events. He was interested in his son's events, and Teddy's coming and going, and Bobby's as well.
But finally, sad events began to take their toll, and on November the 11th, 1969, he took a turn for the worse.
He fought it all the way. He was in, and he went kind of like into a coma, and then he died. It was very peaceful.
The family gathered for a final moment with him. Rose, his wife for over 55 years, was at his bedside. She held his hand as the ambassador breathed his last. He was 81 years old. His funeral was private in a cemetery in Brookline. Senator Edward M. Kennedy delivered the eulogy, speaking words that had been written by his brother, Robert Francis Kennedy, in the privately published book about Joe entitled The Fruitful Bough. It concluded, "His interest in life has been his children, not his business, not his accomplishments, not his friends, but his children. Any lasting contributions we might have made have been in a large part due to the effect he had on our lives." The granite headstone was inscribed with one word, Kennedy.
What everyone says about the Kennedys, they love Joe Kennedy, and they love him now. And he inspires their life and is alive within their lives every day and every moment, believe me.
There's a great picture you probably see of my brother Joe and myself running from the plane into his arms. That comes because he elicited that kind of a love and affection. It meant that we wanted to be with him, and we knew he was excited to see us.
From Irish immigrants, the Kennedy family progressed from the docks of East Boston to saloon keepers, to the court of St. James, and finally to the presidency itself, the very pinnacle of world acclaim.
We all have, our own ways of trying to make this world a little bit better place than the one we find. So I think that's, that sense of trying to do, to achieve is really part of what the legacy of Joseph P. Kennedy really is, and I hope continues to be.